Hello, everybody. This is Parrish Alford with the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal, and I am joined by Randy Rosetta, the LSU beat writer for NOLA.com, the Times Picayune. We're going to talk a little LSU basketball, and it's the South, so we'll throw in some football too. Ole Miss getting ready to take on LSU in Baton Rouge Wednesday night. Randy informs me to get me back on schedule. Randy, how are you, man?
Good. How's it going? I'm glad that we talked because I may have thought it was Thursday too by then.
It just takes a little bit to throw a lot of confusion into the mix, but it is going to be Ole Miss at LSU Wednesday evening at the Pete Maravich Assembly Center in Baton Rouge. Ole Miss coming off two impressive wins at home, coming from behind twice to win against Alabama last Thursday, and then Georgia on Saturday, the first two games in the Rebels' new pavilion at Ole Miss. Randy, the PMAC, man, I had really the privilege, I guess. I really enjoyed it. I was a young college kid at the time of interviewing Pete Maravich shortly before he died. He was doing a camp in in Albany, Louisiana.
You know, the anniversary of his death was just the other day. In fact, it was the day LSU beat Kentucky. So a lot of people said that Pete's spirit was in the arena that night. So that's a pretty cool memory. I've met some pretty big, probably the biggest name I've interviewed that I actually liked, because I did interview Bob Knight, so we won't go there. But I have interviewed Danny Manning here recently because LSU played Wake Forest, and that's the closest for a Kansas kid to Pete Maravich is Danny Manning and the way he played for the Jayhawks back in the late 80s.
Well, I'll tell you, the Pete Maravich story, I don't know all the ins and outs of the relationship with LSU once he left, but it wasn't always a really good thing. Do you know much about the Pete Maravich history with LSU? I mean, obviously they came back around, and now the building's named for him, as it should be, but do you know much about that history there?
Well, obviously the sticking point for a while is that they fired his dad, Press Maravich, the coach, and it took a while to mend some wounds. And Dale Brown was involved in that, and although that won't surprise you because Dale could sell ice to an Eskimo, he reached out to Pete. He had known Pete and Press before. It took some discussions, and they got Pete to come back and speak to players. Dale had him come and talk to a couple of his teams. And by that time, I think Pete was a born-again Christian, and it just kind of clicked. And you're right, he was actually in Baton Rouge right before he went out to Los Angeles, where he unfortunately had the heart issue and passed away.
Yeah, it was really interesting times. It was late in his life, and it wasn't long before he went out to L.A. and died that I was able to interview him in the small town of Albany, there where he was conducting a camp. But let's talk about LSU right now. Randy, the name that jumps out is Ben Simmons, the freshman. But just tell me a little bit about him and tell me about this team. Obviously, it's not just one guy.
It's not, and I tweeted this out the other day. I like the fact that Seth Davis on the CBS broadcast before the game talked about that there were more parts to this team. It's a team that took a while to kind of congeal. They played without Keith Hornsby, and Ole Miss fans will remember Keith Hornsby from last year for the first 6 games. He came back in the 7th game, somewhere in that range. And then Craig Victor, a kid from New Orleans, gained his eligibility the next game. That basically meant they were playing without 2 starters, and not just 2 starters, but these 2 guys are like the heartbeat for this team. They play hard. They bring some intensity. They bring some edge to them. Ben is easily the most talented player, if not in the SEC, then in the country. The thing I've written about him is he's the best freshman in the country. He's the best prospect in the draft. I don't know that he's the best player in the country because he's still a freshman, and there's a difference between a freshman and a Stephon Moody or a Buddy Hield or guys like that have been around. And you sometimes see some of those freshman tendencies. The game against Florida the other day, he had a great numbers game. He had 28 points, and I think 16 rebounds, but then he had 8 second-half turnovers because there's times when he doesn't know the fine line between taking a game over and being too aggressive, and that's swung from the pendulum of for several games he was way too unaggressive. So he's still a freshman. You've seen this plenty of times, I'm sure. Even this late in the season, sometimes even the best of freshmen still struggle to kind of find it. Once he does, and once the other freshman, Antonio Blakeney, finds his shooting stroke, this is going to be a team that's awfully hard to beat anywhere. Now, they're 2-1 in the SEC, a little bit of a flip-flop from what Ole Miss has done. They started out 2-0, went on the road, won at Vandy, had to come back in the second half, then dominated Kentucky. I don't use that word very often when you're talking about a Kentucky basketball game, but they dominated Kentucky. Then went to Florida. Hornsby and Tim Quarterman, their two most veteran guys, got in foul trouble, missed most of the first half, and LSU never really quite recovered in that one.
You mentioned about Hornsby being out and some other guys as well. Has it been hard for this LSU team to establish roles?
I think they're now they're probably about at the 3-week point of the season when you factor in the two guys who missed all that time. Quarterman and Ben Simmons are both point guard types, and I know that's weird to talk about a 6'10" kid being a point guard, but that's what he basically is. And it took a while for them to figure out, if I grab the rebound, the other guy goes ahead and gets up the court and starts into the offense. Now I think they figured that out. The other day was a step backwards a little bit. I thought that Tim at times forced the issue, or not Tim, Ben forced the issue. Had a lot of open teammates on the wings who were open for shots or potentially for drives, and he went ahead and took shots. So a little bit of a step back there, which you expect for a college player, but especially a college freshman. So still kind of a work in progress.
How do you see this team matching up with Ole Miss?
Well, I don't think this is exactly James Naismith stuff here. If you slow down Stephon Moody, you slow down Ole Miss pretty well. Now, I've watched Ole Miss a bunch, and they're a fun team to watch. Andy Kennedy certainly has I don't know if he's crisscrossed the globe to get these guys in, or how he's convinced them, if they were committed to him or to Randy Kennedy. But the fact that they've got those different guys, I love watching the foreign kids because they usually play at a different level. They've been exposed to the game. Ben Simmons is an example. He's from Australia. They're a little bit more mature basketball-wise, and I love watching Ole Miss's team because of that. But Stephon Moody's the guy. If you can contain him and kind of frustrate him, I think you've got a chance to beat Ole Miss. LSU did that last year, and they'll throw some different guys at him. Tim Quarterman will guard him. Hornsby will guard him. Blakeney, who, while he has struggled offensively as a freshman, has really embraced the idea of how to play defense. So he'll get a bunch of different looks against LSU.
Andy Kennedy was really kind of channeling his inner ACC, Randy, after the game the other night. He signed with North Carolina State for basketball before transferring to UAB. And after the Georgia game, he starts throwing out these Clemson references and Dabo Swinney and talking about bring your own guts. And the point he was making was it was a really kind of gutsy win for Ole Miss against Georgia. And I would agree with that because Ole Miss has struggled to shoot this year, number 13 in the SEC in field goal percentage. And they shot just 36.2% against Georgia, but they made buckets at key times. They made key plays at key times. They defended and rebounded really better in the second half than they did in the first half. What's LSU like defensively? You mentioned the different things they'll try on Moody, but overall, have they been able to hold shooting percentages down? I mean, have they been able to force turnovers? What's that part of the game been like for LSU?
If you look at their stats for the whole season, you would think that their defense has really struggled because at times it did in non-conference play, especially without Hornsby and Craig Victor. If you look at just the SEC stats, you see a very different team, both on paper and on the court. They've really ratcheted it up defensively. Went to Vanderbilt and really frustrated Vanderbilt. And as you know, Vanderbilt is one of those teams that's going to run the same stuff every year. They're going to have three-point shooters. They completely baffled Vandy on the three-point line, took that away. Now, Vandy ended up hitting 10 out of 23, I think, but 3 of those were in the last minute when the game was decided. So they were, when the game was still in contention there, I think they were shot 35% for 3. which is good for most teams, is very average for Vanderbilt. Then against Kentucky, they clogged the middle, kind of dared Tyler Ulis to drive a little bit. And Tyler Ulis got his points. Jamal Murray got his points, but nobody else did any damage. So they really controlled things there. Even against Florida in the loss, I think Florida made maybe three. I think there were 3 out of 17 from three-point range. Played a lot of zone when the two guys were in foul trouble in the first half. So what LSU does is they mix and match both defenses and guys who guard key players. They do force some turnovers. And if they get the ball in transition, it's almost impossible for them not to score simply because Simmons is so good in the open court. So they're still kind of a work in progress on defense as well, but they've gotten much better in SEC play.
All right, Randy, shifting gears a little bit. Les Miles, all that drama at the end of the season keeps his job, all of that just playing out for a week on TV, and they still have, I guess, are they a consensus #1 recruiting class right now, or the #1 by some services? They're right up there. How does that happen?
That's kind of what Les Miles has done, along with Frank Wilson and Ed Orgeron, a couple of names that folks up there know well. Corey Raymond, they've always recruited well, and this year they've got a in-state crop that is really, they've harvested really well. Now there's a possibility they may add a 4-star quarterback out of Maryland, which of course quarterback has been the sore spot. Somehow though they have come out of this smelling like a rose. Initially, with all the Les Miles stuff going out, they lost a 5-star quarterback, I believe, a kid named Felipe Franks, who wound up signing with Florida. The other day, and this will be of interest to Ole Miss fans who probably were paying attention because of Shea Patterson. Shea Patterson got the MVP in that game. Felipe Franks was the other quarterback, and he was pretty bad. So it almost looks like LSU knew what it was doing in this thing. And you mentioned Les. Not only did he survive, now it's almost become role reversal. I think Joe Oliva was dangerously close to losing his job. Now Les Miles is saying all the right things and the good things about Joe Oliva in an effort to save his job almost. So it's as LSU football turns here the last few months, and it's really turned out pretty well for Les Miles.
Randy, good stuff, man. Thanks for being with us. I look forward to seeing you down there on Wednesday, not Thursday.
Well, if you want to hang around Thursday too, that's fine.